Now next up is one that I've recently picked up, so I haven't got the chance to really scrub through it all the way yet, especially since it's such a long film. But it's a really interesting earlier box set from one of the majors. This is the Fox Special Widescreen Edition release of the 1963 Cleopatra. Now what makes this interesting is it seems to have been a sort of cross production, because the discs, even though the box art is Fox, the labels are actually Image, which is kind of weird. I didn't expect that. I don't know if all copies are that way, but anyway, beautiful image, nice usage with original poster artwork with the Fox widescreen jacket, and of course it's actually a box because this is a 5-sided title. I do like how they kind of kept with the normal design in the box format, because I think they really didn't make any other real boxes at this point in time. It's just very few and far between. So this is really just a one-off due to it being so long. Anyway, of course, Cleopatra's notorious. Most people label it as one of the great box office bombs, when in actuality it did eventually, I don't know if it ever quite turned a profit, but over a couple years it did eventually make its mammoth cost back. So it's not quite as big of a failure as people make it out to be, but it is a gargantuan epic that really signaled the end of the classic period of star-studded historical epics. Now the rear jacket looks no different than a usual Fox widescreen jacket. It's just a little bit different dimensions, I'd say, because this is a box set, but otherwise it just looks like a normal gatefold release. Now, of course, the film is widescreen, and it does carry a stereo track that does pretty much seem to have Dolby Surround encoding on it, even though it's not listed as such. Now, again, I haven't had much time to really spin through this because it's been quite a while since I've watched the film in its entirety. But what is necessary about having the older transfers is that the new HD Master, while great, and the Blu-ray is wonderful and has all the old extras, well, most of the old extras, and new ones and all kinds of stuff, and you can get it for $5 or $6, which is a steal. There is great debate about its color timing being wrong, and it's nowhere near as warm as the DVDs were, or in fact this Laserdisc is, and or the actual print materials themselves. So do keep that in mind. Now this Laserdisc actually is supposed to have I think just a feature or two at the very end. It's not really listed on the box set, but it's listed on the LDDB page. And I think they're exclusive to this, so if you're a diehard fan of this film or you pick it up, that's another reason that this is important. Now, what you're going to notice that's different about this is this little special box here that says "Please note." And let me look at it so I can actually read you the correct text. Now, it says, "Please note, in certain scenes of this film, you may notice a shimmering effect called aliasing. This is not a defect. In fact, it is indicative of the extreme clarity and detail of the image, which in some widescreen film transfers exceeds the capacity of the video monitor. If you prefer, it may be diminished by decreasing the sharpness on your monitor." That's a first for me, and I didn't know that was on here until I found this, and I had to buy it for that alone. Now again, I haven't gone through the entire thing because, the film is over 4 hours long. But what I did notice is, it is an older transfer, it is from the late 80s, and it is a big gargantuan widescreen epic, so those don't necessarily always play very well with 420i composite video, especially older composite video. So yes, you sure as heck do see some aliasing, and I've only gone through a little bit of this. Now, aliasing happens on Laserdisc all the time, especially even on a CRT. It's just going to happen sometimes. Now, this technical explanation actually does a relatively decent, it gives you an idea of what causes aliasing, but many other things can cause aliasing. And the whole point of making a good video transfer is to not have visible aliasing. That's kind of something you want to stay away from. And there are, some films that have transfers with so much aliasing that it's actually detrimental. Like, say, for example, the special Pioneer edition of Cliffhanger, which has tons of it. I've seen people complain about transfers like the widescreen Raiders of the Lost Ark and saying that it has aliasing problems. Well, it has a little visible aliasing here and there, but that's to be expected. That's nothing. But this has a lot, so just be forewarned. Anyway, but what I found was really interesting. You get a little insert, which is pretty cool. Like I said, they really hadn't done many of these at this point in terms of a box set, so this is kind of a spiffy first attempt, I would say. You get your cast and staff list. It's really nicely laid out, and you get this entire text about the making of the intimate epic Cleopatra. I don't really know how intimate a film can be if it's so large that they decided they were nearly going to split it into 2 separate releases and hope they could make their money back. So I don't really know how that's intimate. And then one panel actually has one of the lobby posters. A lot of lobby posters were printed in a horizontal format, and so this is what you would see on like an easel or pedestal display or on the wall of the actual lobby. As you can see, it's advertising that you can see all these great events in Cleopatra. And this is something that's really kind of completely died out. All we have now that's a remnant of this style of display and advertising are pretty much just the 3D cardboard standees, and that's about it. Oh, and I forgot, it does give you your chapter listings. So this is what I was talking about earlier. The discs themselves carry the image label instead of the Fox label, which is quite strange. And it has the old CD video logo, but weirdly enough, it says that it's a mono mix, which it's not. So I don't know why it's that way. All the discs have an image label, all the discs say mono, but again, I have no idea. So it does, and it's a Technidisc pressing too, so interesting to note. But anyway, an actually pretty nice release, and like I said, an earlier box set of classic titles, so they're still learning the ropes on how to really do this right. But if you can find it for pretty cheap, it's worth a watch. But of course, the DVD is going to knock this out of the park. It's actually a really good DVD for the time period, and but both will have the color timing seemingly more correct than the otherwise great Blu-ray. So here we have one of the big epic box sets of Laserdisc. Easily one of the best, if not the most impressive in terms of outer packaging that I've physically seen. This is the limited collection edition of Dances with Wolves. This is the premiere of the long 4-hour version. And it's just really an incredible piece of work. I'm trying to make sure I get it sized in my camera because this is just so large. It's easily another of the ones that most fans and collectors have in a separate shelf display area because it does not fit on any shelf. It's almost as tall as the Fantasia box and much thicker. And what's most impressive is this design that is also on the gatefold standard version of the long cut. Uses this same artwork, but here you of course have the titular wolf rendered here in the background, and it's done into a design that looks exactly, and has to be the inspiration for this, like the tattered cover of John Dunbar's notebook, well, his journal. And it's beautifully done. The cover is fully laminated with the text and it being fully embossed, and the cover has that leathery feel to it again, but here it really gives across that notion of being from an old tattered notebook or journal of this era, and it does a beautiful job at doing that. Now if I flip over to the rear, it just has one of those paper inserts tacked on the back, but it was nice that they actually did one that runs the full length, and the dead space keeps that motif going, so it's not just a dead blob of color around a block of information. And if you lift this up, it actually has that leathery brown continuing on the back, so it's uniform. Of course, I picked this up and it was still sealed, so this is still on here, and I'm afraid it'll just tear or do something if I try to take it off. So I'm just not really going to worry about it. But anyway, this details the contents of the box set. So you get the long cut, and it includes the making of documentary across side 5. You get the soundtrack CD standard release included. You get the making of book, which I'll get into when I open this up. And you get these really nice, they're supposed to be lobby cards, but they're full-on printed stills, which is really nice. But bigger, bolder, more breathtaking than ever, because they put back in so much material. And what's interesting to note about this is this has never been labeled as a director's cut or a producer's cut or anything. It's unknown if this or the original version is the true director's cut. And unfortunately, ever since this came out, it's kind of supplanted the theatrical version. And it's been a little while since I've actually sat down and watched this in its entirety, but I last watched the shorter theatrical cut, which I hadn't seen in years, and I was quite surprised at how different the pacing was. In some ways, I felt it actually ran better, but then there were some elements of the long version that I missed, so I think that's an interesting comparison, and I think both versions should be kept in circulation. I think it's really kind of a shame that the theatrical version that won all the Academy Awards that year has now been kind of put aside and lost, because the last time it was released here in the States was the first Image DVD release. If you wanted an HD, you have to go and get the import Blu-rays from either Britain or Germany, and then you have to have a region-free player because those are region-coded and locked. Here in the States, all you can get is the long version now. So hopefully they do a 4K release of the film, which would be wonderful, and they should do it. It would be an absolute seller. There's no reason why you shouldn't. I feel like I'm a broken record on this, but I really don't want catalog releases to go the way of the dodo. If it hadn't been for a lot of these smaller labels and then some studio offshoots, they've been actively, it seems like they've been trying to kill off catalog titles. And the ones that have come out in 4K so far have been wonderful for the most part. So Dances with Wolves should absolutely be released in 4K and have both its theatrical Oscar-winning version and the long version included. So if any studio people out there are listening, please make it so. So anyway, I'd also like to point out the spine here. I don't know how well this is going to come across, but you have the Dances with Wolves logo. You have the actual listing of, Laserdisc Limited Collector's Edition, and then the studio logos and the Laserdisc logo. But the way this is done absolutely, to me, suggests, being like a fine work of literature being printed in a fancy hardbound edition. This is the dead giveaway, the way this is laid out, so you could have this on a shelf, which, of course, this doesn't fit on any shelf. But if it were, it would look like, a great favorite a favorite novel that you have in this really nice leather-bound edition. So that's a really nice touch, and for me, being quite a bit of a book nerd, it's something I really appreciate. Now, when you open this, it's still the attached hinge style, which for something so big, I wish they had just gone with a lift top box. But the nice thing is, it's done in a way to where it actually is freestanding. And you can actually just have it display like this, sort of like a jewelry box or something. So I will give them that. That at least works, but I'm sure that hinge would get worn down if you were to open and close this a lot. So this is really just more of a display piece, but still, at least it's functional and it looks nice when you display it. Now here is I'm trying to say what I'm doing, but here are the included stills, and again, these are extremely large, and they're in this nice plastic protection sleeve. A lot of times box sets would just kind of tuck these in there, and they would get folded, torn up, damaged, faded, so it's nice to actually see that they put these in a protective cover. So if I can slip these out. It's kind of hard to do this and still see what I'm doing with this hinge lid covering everything, but here we go. And again, these are high gloss photo paper, beautifully done. These are kind of bigger than lobby cards. These are absolutely wall displays, and absolutely frameable, because these are on really glossy photo stock, so you could easily frame these, and they are professional studio stills, so, and just beautifully done. I'm not one for swag normally, and if something includes little poster and lobby card reproductions, I mean, that's fine and nice and all, but if I really want that piece, I'll go find it, or a reproduction of it if the original is astronomical. But if you're going to do something, then absolutely go for the gold and do it right. And these are just incredible. And I think the image choices are also really, really good. I mean, I'm sure these are right from the original studio promotional campaign, because they look exactly like it. They may have just printed some extra runs and included it in here, because this looks exactly like what you would have gotten in the original press kits. And each one really gives off the scope of the film and its photography, so absolutely well done. I don't know how well this is coming across here. I'm trying to squeeze everything in so it actually fits on my inside my camera lens, but these are so glossy that if you move around the light, it'll immediately pick up and flare all over the place, but you at least get the idea of the level of quality these were printed with. And here's the last one. So again, not an essential part of a box set, but again, if you're going to include stills, really do it right, and these do. And of course, this is something you're never likely to see again, due to everything being much smaller these days, much more streamlined. And but even if I think you printed with this level of detail on a postcard size and included that in a Blu-ray, that would at least be worthwhile. So here is the disc itself. I'll do the bottom contents first, since that way I can spread the other out. I'm going to do this so I can see what I'm doing. So the bottom tray is actually velvet, and it's specially cut to hold not only the book and the CD, but it also slots in the actual disc cover itself, which is nice, so everything stays protected without sliding around, and the photos actually slot in on top of that, and it's just big enough to where those don't slide around and get damaged. So if you pick up one of these used, you stand a good chance of actually having everything survive intact even after all this time. So this is the soundtrack that's included. This is the standard, I think this was released in 1990, the standard 90s CD release. Gives you most of the iconic themes and such, so if you have this, it's a good rendition of the score. Of course, this has been supplanted by multiple later releases. I think Sony released a gold CD of this with, I think, a different mastering, and then they again released a expanded version with some extra tracks. Then I think there was a 2 CD release that was further expanded and had some extras. And then finally, La La Land released a 2 CD complete score that is designed to be the definitive soundtrack release. So I've got to pick that one up, because I haven't actually gotten the chance to hear that version yet, and I'm a big John Barry fan. While admittedly this isn't his greatest score, you can hear a lot of similarities to some of his other work, especially me being such a Bond diehard. I can't help but hear almost references and thematic ideas that are pulled from some of his Bond scores, or that just may be inherent to his working style. But it's still a fantastic score, and is what won him his Oscar, which is great. But if you're just wanting a good soundtrack CD of the film score and you pick this up, this will do you fine. It's well mastered, but just do be aware there are later and greater soundtrack releases. Tuck back in there. Now, the book, unlike a lot of sets, especially modern ones, is not a throwaway. I know a lot of the modern Blu-ray sets, like the big Warner Brothers boxes full of swag, as I like to call them, the big shelf fillers. They usually have a hardcover book in there, and yeah, it's kind of nice, but it's like a miniaturized coffee table book. The printing's only okay, and it doesn't really tell you anything you didn't know. This book is really, really well done. I think it may have been available separately, but I don't know for sure if it was just exclusive to this, but it's a really worthwhile supplement. It is filled and packed with production information and photographs, on-set photographs. Everything is actually captioned, so you can actually reference everything. It's full of informative text, script excerpts, and the cast and crew ruminating on the meaning of the film and what their intent was. So this is a really well put together book, I have to say. It's definitely readable on its own, even if you haven't seen the film. And of course, it's not like it's going to tell you absolutely everything, but it's a really good place to start. It's easily, readable on its own. You just want to sit down with this and read it cover to cover at least once. And again, the photographs are well chosen, very well printed. And it's nice that it's actually soft cover, so it's easy to flip through, and it's not a cumbersome, tightly bound hardback. And you even have storyboard excerpts. You have storyboard sequences reprinted in here. So it's just a really, really nice accompaniment. And what I really enjoyed is here on the cover page, you have copied actual signatures of key cast and crew members. So I always think that's a really, really nice touch when somebody took the time to actually put their signature on something. Obviously they're reprinted, and obviously it's just kind of it could be seen as a marketing thing, but I just really like the touch that this adds. So excellent book included. Definitely one of the best in a Laserdisc box set that I've seen. Now, actually moving on to the disc itself, this replicates the outer cover on the Laserdisc jacket, and this is exactly what you would see on the standalone release. But I think that's just a 2-disc gatefold, whereas this is a 3-disc trifold. So you open it up. Because it's a trifold, the discs kind of want to fly out a little. But here is the beautiful gatefold, which the inner packaging on here starts to resemble the old letterbox release of the theatrical cut, but it's very well done. It's kind of offset because the side has the chapter listing. So here you see the film is spread across 5 sides and culminates in the Making of Dances with Wolves program. So if I'm remembering correctly, the standalone release of this is just a I think it removes the making of documentary, but I think everything else is the same. I can't remember if it tries to squeeze the film onto 4 sides or if it has to jump onto 5 sides. But anyway, when you open the center panel, let's try to pop out, you get this note about the new vision of the Old West. And if you read all of the text on here, there's a little bit that's replicated from the original letterbox release, but it's mostly all new. But you get this beautiful, beautiful amount of text here. And as you can see, it actually goes over onto the 3rd panel. So it's a very informative piece, and thankfully enough is rendered to fit the packaging design and tone and film of the story and time period, but it's also rendered in a readable, legible text typeface, which is very nice because it's very common for Laserdisc to either be very small printing that you have to squint to read and then you have a lot of dead space, or very large typeface so you can't fit very much on there, and thus it's very uninformative and doesn't really tell you anything you don't know. So this is a very, very nice companion text to the film. The discs themselves don't have a special disc label, they just have the regular image label. So that's really the only part that doesn't really have the grandeur of a box set. You would have thought they would have had custom labels. Now here's the rear cover, and it is rather similar to the original letterbox release in the text and the actual description. You have the note about it being letterboxed, and you have the Dolby Surround logo. In terms of picture, sound, and overall transfer quality, I do think this is a technical improvement over the old theatrical cut disc. Of course, this was made in 93, 94 as opposed to 1990, so you have the advancements in pressing and equipment improvement over time. Now, this is also the premiere of a slightly different look. All the releases of the theatrical cut are kind of a more warm color timing. There's some more yellows and browns and even some reds in there. And it's reported that the cinematographer really disliked that. So starting with this release of the long cut, it seems the film has been color timed to be a bit more naturalistic. And it seems that every release of the long version looks like that. So even the modern releases of the theatrical cut have been pulled from the extended cut master. So now they look that way if you manage to get those European import discs. And this, which is correct, I don't really know if the cinematographer says it's supposed to be one way. Well, he's the guy who shot it, but I'm used to the more warm look because that's the first way I saw it on tape and later the early DVDs and then that first Laserdisc. So that is an interesting difference to note. And if you put this side by side with the theatrical cut disc, you're instantly going to notice that the color's a bit different. So that's something that doesn't really get discussed very often that I wanted to bring up. So outside of that, the picture quality is improved on a technical level. It's a bit sharper, a little bit more finely detailed, so that's a nice improvement. And even though this is a much longer film pressed on Laserdisc, it does so pretty well, I think. The side breaks are nice. I don't recall there being like any abrupt ones or anything. The sound mix is a Dolby Surround encoded 2.0 mix. Matrix Surround, just like the theatrical cut disc and the original theatrical release, was a Dolby SR film because it predated AC3 5.1. There were some 70mm blow-up prints made, which would have had a Dolby 70mm mix, but I do believe that was just a mono surround. It was kind of debatable whether films would get a 70mm track with a split stereo surround or just keep the mono surround. I can't remember for certain, but I do believe it was mono surround. A lot of this is just kind of people remembering or having to find old studio records, and there's a lot of information on this topic. If you go to the N70mm website, you can look at a list of 70mm blow-up prints, and they do their best to give an accurate description of whether it had a Dolby stereo track or a track with a split stereo surround in the 80s or 90s. So that's something to note. But the original film sound design is basically centered around the 4-channel setup. Now later releases have upmixed this to 5.1, and then the Blu-ray here in the States upmixed that further to 7.1. And I've kind of done some comparisons, and they don't really seem to have changed anything, which is good. But I'd like to hear films with their original sound design, and even if that means going back to the matrixed audio track, that's how you would have seen this film in the 35mm general release. So I'd like to try and stick with that as much as possible. And I really find it interesting for the time period and for that constraint how good the sound design is on a lot of sequences, especially the Buffalo sequence is still to this day a really well designed sequence in terms of sound design, and I find it really interesting how much they were able to convey even in the 4-channel matrixed format. So in terms of sound and picture, I do think this is an improvement over the older disc, but do keep in mind it is the longer version, so it is a completely different edit of the film. So you get the making of documentary on the end with a PCM stereo track. It has been replicated on the later releases, so the only benefit to having this outside of the beautiful box and the large extras and things is going to be having the PCM rendering of not only the documentary audio, but having the 2.0 stereo surround PCM audio of the long version, which as far as I know is only 5.1 or 7.1 on all the DVDs and Blu-rays. There might be a DVD that had a 2.0 lossy Dolby Digital rendering of this stereo surround, But if you're like me and you've gotten hooked on PCM, that's the big benefit of having the long version on Laserdisc. But all of the accompanying extras and just the packaging itself is absolutely gorgeous. Definitely one of the best Laserdisc box sets for packaging. So I definitely recommend it if you're a fan of the film. But if you don't want the fancy box, you can easily pick up the standalone release. All right, so moving on alphabetically. This is a really nice set that's actually not that common. This is the Dirty Harry collection. And it's an interesting package design. It's just a standard black jacket, but with the text is actually embossed, which is a nice touch. And then you have the photo of Harry himself, but it's printed in a glossy style. So even though this is very minimalist, I really like the design of this. It looks much better when you have it in your hands. And I never intended to pick this up because I wasn't like a Dirty Harry fan, and it had been a long time since I'd seen him. But it appeared for a decent price, and I know the films had their audio tracks remixed on all the later releases, so I figured I'd give this a go, and I was very pleasantly surprised. Now, if you flip over to the back, again, it keeps this minimalist design, but I actually quite like it. For a Warner Brothers release, the packaging design on here is actually really interesting. Again, you have the flat black cover, and then the images are printed in a very glossy style, all extremely detailed, and from the individual films. So it really has a touch of class to it, which is very welcome, because for the most part, the Dirty Harry series has seen increasingly, well, I won't say any of them really have bad covers, because they've stuck for the most part with the original poster artwork. So, but I just, something about this I really like. And the text is simple, mentions every film, and then actually gives you the technical specs of each film, and that each film is actually listed whether it's widescreen or not. All of these are widescreen except for the Deadpool, which replicates its Laserdisc separate release, and it's a it's roughly an open matted transfer, because that film was actually shot in 1.8.5 as opposed to being a anamorphic scope feature. But I know there's debate on in a lot of circles really on if all 133 discs of widescreen films are technically open mat, or if they're just pan and scan jobs, or you really have to do a comparison. But after you look at a lot of discs and you kind of compare them to their widescreen video versions, you can kind of get a sense of when a film is opened up in some places or just pan and scan from the negative. But anyway, I thought that was really nice that they actually list which films are widescreen, and if you notice, they list Deadpool as being the only one that has a Dolby Surround encoded stereo track, which is roughly true. It's a little misleading, because I'm going to have to explain the audio side of these films. Now, otherwise, you get the Warner widescreen logo. This is mostly a CLV set. I think it has 1 or 2 CIV sides, but it also includes the theatrical trailer for each film on the CAV 5th side, which is a really nice touch that they're all together as well. And it includes the Man from El Paso Clint Eastwood documentary, which is really just another 45-minute studio promotional piece, kind of done around this time period, just after Unforgiven and such. So if you've seen one of those, you've seen 1,000. Doesn't really tell you anything, and it's a lot of PR mumbo jumbo. But you watch it once, it's part of the box set. Okay. And that has a PCM, I think it's mono or stereo, but it's PCM. That's a nice bonus. Anyway, so when you actually open this up, it's just a lift top box. The nice part is it's a little sturdier than most, so it's not as common to want to fly open and have broken corners and such. The booklet replicates the artwork of the box, and it's also a nice flat printing job, which is, again, I just, something about this I really love, even though it's a weird minimalist art design. And here again you have the listing of the films in order and the note of having the documentary included. Kind of the reverse of the cover image. Again, I just love the way this is designed and laid out. Here you have a note about the series, again printed like the other page, so it has a nice classiness to it. And the essay is kind of nice. And here you have the chapter breakdown for each film, and they've kind of made everything kind of fit together, but they kept the original text of the end logo of each film, which is another nice touch. Again, the print job is wonderful. It looks really classy. Now the interesting thing is, I guess they did this because of the way of the how long the disc ran, but they've tucked the documentary in the middle of the disc. So once you get through Magnum Force, the second film, if you watch the disc in order, you would run right into the documentary. So you have to remember to skip to side 7 if you're just watching the films, and then come back to this. Which, I wish it had been left as the final side, but I can understand that they probably just tucked this in there so they wouldn't have a dead side and they could just get it in there without having to put a whole extra disc in. So I totally get that, but this is a nice rendering and gives you reference of where each film is and what side it starts on. And, you actually get full chapter breakdowns, which isn't common for a full-on series release. Now, in terms of the discs themselves, standard Warner Treat Me Right Laserdisc care jacket, which, I don't know, these are so associated with Warner in my mind and Laserdisc that I'm so used to it, but the Treat Me Right thing has always kind of cracked me up. Now, the disc itself, standard Warner Home Video jacket, standard label, so nothing special there. And all the discs are just kind of tucked in there. Now, where I really have to do a bit of discussion on this, and this wasn't something I necessarily realized when I picked this up and watched them all the way through, is the audio of each film. Now, quite surprisingly, all of the films were originally mono. Even Sudden Impact seemingly was a mono film release. They didn't spend money on Dolby Stereo until the last film, which I felt was kind of interesting. But as far as I can tell, all of the films in the series, the first 5, all have been stereoized on all of their VHS, Laserdisc, beta releases. And I have not yet been able to find releases with the original mono mixes for the films. There may be some, like some obscure foreign releases, or there might be an elusive VHS copy that I haven't found yet that has mono. But at this era, Warner Brothers was doing this with a lot of films, especially action-oriented films. The other notable film where the mono is completely gone is Bullet. You can only get this stereoized 2.0 track. So all of these have been stereoized, and you can actually listen to it with your matrix surround decoding on, and you'll get a little bit of surround information. It spreads across the room better. But essentially what they did was they went in and they seemingly went back to the dialogue, music, and effects stems and tried to make it more stereo. And while I really hate any type of fakery like that, for the most part, it always backfires. On these, because especially the first film, the score is very jazzy, and the sound effects are very old school and very punchy. It kind of works in a sort of way, and at least the original sound design in terms of effects has not been changed, because on the DVDs and Blu-rays they have brand new 5.1 remixes that have different sound effects. There's even an instance in the second film where Harry's signature 44 Magnum effect has been removed, which makes absolutely no sense, but okay. So if you want to hear the original sound design, this is as close as you're going to get. They are PCM. They do sound really good. They are dynamic, so they probably are technically more robust than the original mono tracks, but I just wish there would be a release with the original audio for these and for Bullet at some point. If these do come out on 4K, which I'm sure they will at some point when Warner gets around to it, please include the original mono tracks, because they've been gone for all of videodom. So anyway, The picture quality kind of ranges. As I've said before, Warner Brothers discs really are not always going to be top tier in terms of video, but I was pleasantly surprised that all of them look good. I would say, of course, the first film is the best in terms of artistic quality, but I would say as the films go on, the transfers get a little stronger. I'd say the first two are probably a bit noisier, but it gets better. Deadpool looks good, even though it is 1:3:3. I wish they had just made it widescreen, but you know, it is what it is, and it definitely has the most polished sound mix of the series because it's the only one that is Dolby Surround. So anyway, that is the Dirty Harry set. The first film was later released in a AC3 reissue towards the end of the format, and that was ported to DVD. So you can pick that up, and I'm sure the video quality is going to be a little bit better. It also has the original poster art for the cover. So I'd like to get that for a comparison, but of course it does not have the original mono still. So anyway, this is a nice set if you can find one. It does seem to be a bit rarer and thus pricier. So just keep that in mind. Speaking of rarer and pricier sets, this is the Clint Eastwood trilogy, but I myself just view it as the Dollars trilogy, because that's basically what it is. Whether you want to call it the Dollars trilogy, the Man with No Name trilogy, the early Leone westerns, whatever you want to call it. But this is just a box set combining the standalone letterbox releases that MGM did for the Dollars films. And they're pretty much identical to those, just put in a nice box set. Those themselves are not super common, and I'm going to try and keep this short and succinct, but ever since I've gotten into these, I've been wading through the video nightmare that is the history of Leone's films on home video. There's practically not a film that he made that doesn't have alternate versions and a mixed video history. So, and I've written to the studio about some of these issues and gotten rejected and ignored. I was actually one of the first studio letters I ever wrote when I was about, I think, 12 or so. I wrote in and got my first crazy person rejection letter. But anyway, so what makes this important is that each of these are essentially a representation of the studio elements they had at the time. So if you want to get into the transfer history very briefly of each film, Fistful of Dollars, MGM only has limited rights to that because it was not originally produced by United Artists. They picked it up later after having production on the second and third film. So they only have a dupe of the negative. So Fistful of Dollars on all US versions is always going to look a bit grainier, a bit lighter, and not as detailed as versions from Europe sustaining from the Italian negative. So that being said, this is still a nice disc. It's of course thankfully letterboxed. It has the original English mono track, and unlike the later releases, it does not have any noise reduction going on, so it sounds much better than a lot of the DVDs, and especially the American Blu-ray. And later on, Kino just came out with the release of the newer 4K Italian restored version, which has the messed up colors and that are just like the fiasco of the Italian new Good Bad Ugly disc. So that's just a travesty, ignore it. But anyway, if you want the version on Laserdisc, this is what you're going to go for, whether you get this or the standalone. It's uncut, it's got relatively good picture quality, the print does have a little bit of damage, but it's pretty much what you would have seen in Grindhouse's second run theaters, and it's far better than the god-awful pan and scan releases. It was also ported to the first MGM DVD release, so if you pick that up, it's the same print transfer, but it doesn't have the PCM untouched mono of the Laserdisc. For a few dollars more is a bit more complicated. Here, MGM does have the negative and later did a negative restoration for the remastered DVD and their Blu-ray. On the Laserdisc, though, it's actually a transfer of a Studio Vault print element, and it's the same print that I managed to see in about 2007 or so at a Art House Leone retrospective, and it was the only print MGM had at the time, and it had deteriorated quite a bit in that interim. But what's interesting is it's a slightly different edit of the film. As Leone fans know, For a Few Dollars More was cut down in 1967 when it was finally released here by United Artists, and a few scenes of violence were trimmed from the international original, and but most crucially, the mentioning of Eastwood's character's name is Monco by the representative when he's answering Colonel Mortimer's question about a different bounty, saying that Monco is already after it. That little piece of dialogue in the end of that scene was cut from all U.S. prints to fit with the United Artists campaign of "The Man with No Name will change Westerns forever." So they should have never have done that. No one was really going to pay that much attention. And he has a name clearly in all three films, but irregardless. But what this shows is it has the extended version of the prison sequence. So it has the violence edited, but when Indio is broken out, he laughs, and there's a transition to his laughing on the Wanted poster printed. Now, in the international version and in this, from that studio print, the laugh is much longer and full, whereas the other U.S. releases, including the DVD, it is shortened. Why there's a difference and what the various sources are, nobody really knows, but that is a difference. This also is missing a couple other little tiny bits, and it has one or two other things from the Italian version. So it is a slightly different edit of the film. And when it came to DVD, they restored the mentioning of Monco's character name, but all of the other extensions are gone, and the film is otherwise uncut. However, when they put that scene back in, it threw off the timing and sync of the audio, thus creating some errors for about the first 20 or 30 minutes. So that threw off the timing of the introduction of Monco. When Eastwood looks up, he goes into a close-up that's supposed to be timed to the thunderclap of the thunderstorm that has appeared with his introduction. And this is getting very geeky. I'm just trying to summarize as best as possible. So there are a multitude of very tiny edits in different versions of the second film of the series. But the Laserdisc is otherwise excellent. It does have some print damage, but the mono is excellent and again untouched by noise reduction. But it is the only release of this slightly different version. Now, if you were to pick it up on Blu-ray, the only way you can get the fully uncut version is by importing the German release, which takes the MGM master, which was done from the negative, which is great, but it has a lot of digital noise reduction and edge enhancement and all this stuff that was more part of the DVD era, so it's really outdated these days. So they took that and kind of went back to a earlier version of it, so it has less noise reduction, less edge enhancement, but it does have a bit of dirt and speckles and stuff, but that's nitpicking. But anyway, most interestingly, they actually took the time and went and found all of the missing pieces from all the various versions across the globe and actually conformed them to the MGM master, and thus their release is the only 100% complete version of For a Few Dollars More anywhere in the world. So you can pick that up. It's easily importable from Amazon Germany. It's a region-free disc. There's no reason why you shouldn't have it, because you can get it in a double feature set with their version of Fistful of Dollars, which uses the superior first Italian restoration, and both films include the English mono tracks. They are region free, and you can import that disc for about $10 US, so it's 100% recommended. But if you want these films on Laserdisc, these are what you're going to pick up. You can either get this box set or get these standalone discs. But you do need to be aware Leone films always have differences across formats, different releases. And that being said, we come on to The Good, the Bad, and the Ugly, which of course, like the first two, has some idiosyncrasies on Laserdisc. This is a repackaging of the first standalone letterbox release of the film, which interestingly enough was culled from both US and Italian sources. So when you watch this, it's the 1966 international edit of the film for the most part, but the character captions on screen, when you get the freeze frames with the famous captions that appear for each of the characters, those are actually in Italian, which indicates that those sections of the film and a few others were derived from an Italian print source. Now the audio track is the English mono 100%, so that's the only visible giveaway that it's actually partly an Italian source. So it is a little bit jarring when you watch it for the first time. But that was later changed for the 1998 revisit on Laserdisc and DVD, which was also the first appearance of the Italian exclusive scenes that were never in any English version and thus never dubbed into English. Now those were later incorporated into the ill-advised, extended, long English language version with the horrendous 5.1 audio remix, which was downright criminal with all the replaced effects. But anyway, the difference between this disc and the 1998 version is admittedly rather minimal, but there are some differences in the editing and the sequences of some shots and the actual placement of shots in certain sequences. So it is very important to have this release. Of the three, this is the most important to have on Laserdisc because it does have exclusive differences. And the 1998 version should not be looked at as being a full-on representation of the 1966 international cut, because it's really a video release that has a slightly different edit to other versions, and it's unknown how exactly this came about. It just is. So like I said, it is not easy to research and understand each of Leone's films because they have multitudes of different edits across different countries, and The Good, the Bad, and the Ugly is no exception. So if you want the most authentic, accurate, official release of the film, I hate to say it, but it is this 1991 letterbox release. Despite it having Italian captions, it has, seemingly the correct editing, and it does have the original English mono without any noise reduction, tape hiss removal, etc. So the audio also is excellent, authentic, and sounds as it should. Now, of course, it's not technically as good as the 1998 disc. In comparison, the color can seem almost a bit washed out. It's a little lighter, it's a bit contrastier. There is some visible print damage here and there, but some of that continues into the 98 release, which seems to use some of the same elements that this did. But of course, that's a late release disc, and comparing a disc from the early 90s to the late 90s is not really a fair technical comparison either. But this is the most authentic release that you can get officially. And it pains me to say that here in the United States, this is still probably the best version you can actually buy, which is actually quite ludicrous after all this time. Now, to give a quick rundown of the other later editions, so the 1998 Laserdisc has the different video edit. It included the Italian additional sequences on a bonus side. That was ported to a DVD, which is the same master and everything, so it looks a bit better because it's on a DVD, but it's also all crammed onto one disc, including the Italian scenes, so it can suffer a bit from that instead of spreading it onto two discs. But unfortunately, the sound goes down to lossy Dolby Digital, but it still sounds good for what it is. But for some reason there's a shot difference in the DVD compared to the Laserdisc, so why that happened I don't know, so that creates another difference. Then came the extended English language version, which was done photochemically with new print struck, and then the DVD release came out, which was okay in terms of picture quality, but it wasn't that much of an improvement over the old release, and had some edge enhancement issues in addition to not having the original soundtrack. It did have the Italian mono though, because the Italian scenes had been dubbed in Italian but never into English. that was essentially ported to the first Blu-ray, which then had a lot of digital noise reduction applied to it. So that is a DNR riddled, grained out mess, and it's also got tons of edge enhancement. So that was messy. And then came an Italian release by Mondo on Blu-ray, which has nice color and but is unfortunately only Italian, region locked, now out of print, and not really a proper reference for the film in terms of color grading, but at least it looked good and didn't have all the DNR and edge enhancement of the MGM release. Then comes the 4K Italian newer restoration that was first released by MGM here. Fantastic detail, but unfortunately was the victim of a atrocious color timing decision that was labeled as being authentic, which it is not, and renders the film in garish hues that were not part of any of the original Technicolor printing runs. And as far as anyone's been able to discern, no print of the film in the world anywhere before that point ever looked anything like that. And that mentality has now been applied to the newer 4K Fistful of Dollars Italian restoration. But that version, the color timing is so bad that it basically negates the incredible picture quality that is otherwise there, and again has a sound remix. And later pressing runs of that actually added a version of the mono, but those are only in later pressing runs. This was later put out by Kino, who decided to try and do their own attempts at correcting the Italian master, which this both helped and didn't help. So it was definitely a case of one step forward, two steps backward. So that version is also compromised, and they included a second disc labeled as the theatrical version, otherwise known as the international cut. But what it actually is they took the Italian version they had tweaked and simply recut it and conformed it not to the international cut, which is pretty much represented by this Laserdisc, but to the 1998 video release. So that is another misnomer, and is also derived from the problematic Italian new master. So that is another disc that really is just a bit of a mess. So it's really not even worth picking up whatsoever. So again, I hate to say it, but the best release of The Good, the Bad, and the Ugly to this day is this 1991 Laserdisc release. So that's why this is important, and these are not super common among Laserdiscs, so that's why they can be a bit pricier. And I was quite happy to find this box set, even though it's just a repackaging of the individual discs, which are, it's usually easier to get the individual discs versus finding this box set. But either or, for a Leone fan, and if you're a Leone fan and you have a Laserdisc player, you need all three of these. For just being a film fan in general, these films are all masterpieces. That is besides the point. You don't even have to discuss that. And their historical importance is absolutely secured. But these Laserdiscs are important for the various differences in edits, and having a nice solid letterbox transfer in the Laserdisc era. Because before this point, they were pretty much pan and scan to death, and with Leone's compositional style, that was downright criminal. Now, the rear cover is actually a pretty standard MGM style cover design. As you can see, it has the gold bar they like to use on the top in this era, but it actually goes with the gold bar across the front, so it actually carries over. So for once, it actually, to the eye, makes a little bit more sense. Just a standard description here. So this is pretty much what one of their normal rear covers would have looked like, but this is what you got on the box set. Now, this does contain a trailer for each of the three films, and you do get a nice little paper insert showing you the chapter breakdown, the side breakdowns. Of course, the films run back to back, so that way they didn't have to have an entire side for, the last bit of a film and waste the rest of a side. So you'll avoid that by getting the standalone releases. You'll be able to just have the films separated instead of running into each other. But again, once you see one Laserdisc box set, you kind of understand that's going to happen. That was just a, space, convenience, cost thing. So once you know how that works, you kind of get over it. And then here you have basically the other side giving just the standard blurb about each film. This is pretty much what would be on the rear cover of the individual releases, and then the casting credits. So definitely a bit nicer than one of their regular MGM box sets that just combine films, but and definitely rarer. I don't even think they printed too many of these, and just the standard MGM yellow label. So I just tucked in here on top of foam insert. I just wanted to get the technical and edition specs across first, because that's what really makes these important to have on Laserdisc. Particularly the good, the bad, and the ugly is the most important of the three. And for a few dollars more is interesting because it has that slightly different edit that I had only ever seen before on that MGM studio print. So that's why these are important. And again, it's going to be much easier to get the individual releases, but and they're the same as this box set, so don't feel like you have to get this box set because it's different or better or something. So but still extremely important Laserdiscs of some of the absolute greatest films ever made. Now on a similar tack, this is a relatively uncommon box set repackaging of films available individually. This is the Godfather Collector's Edition Laserdisc set from Paramount. And this is, this particular example is rather weathered and beat up, but the reason why I wanted to pick this up is it's definitely uncommon. You more often are going to see the Godfather Saga box set, which is the made-for-television chronological re-editing of the films. But I've actually found that this particular box is rather uncommon. There's also, I believe, a box set of the final THX Dolby AC3 encoded Laserdisc versions of the three films. But what this does is actually repackage the older open mat 133 transfers of 1 and 2 with the original mono as PCM, with 3 and a making of documentary. I think it's Inside the Godfather Family or something. I can't remember the exact title. So in a lot of ways, this is like the Dirty Harry box, where it repackages the previously available discs with a making of documentary. And I went ahead and picked this up because I wanted to see if it was any different than the older discs, and which I had picked up originally because of their different ratio, and they're the only releases of 1 and 2 with the original mono tracks and lossless quality. Because as amazing as the Coppola restoration that Robert Harris did was, and still is, the original mono tracks for 1 and 2 kind of got short shrift in favor of lossless 5.1 tracks. They're there, and thank goodness they are, but they're lossily encoded. So here you get this nice booklet, and again, I'm sorry this is so beat up and weathered, but it's still a pretty rare release to have. The interior page has this kind of floral motif design, looks sort of like wallpaper of sorts. And here you have a little introductory piece by Francis Ford Coppola himself. And here you have replication of the original disc artwork. This is exactly the front cover and rear cover of the original standalone release of Godfather Part 1. Well, just The Godfather. Although, interestingly enough, the original standalone disc has the old style corner that says laser, I can't remember exactly. It's the old triangle with lines in it that basically just says laser video disc. And on here, as you can see, it's been replaced with the more modern Paramount usage of the actual Laserdisc logo. They had switched to that in the early 90s, so I think that's an interesting little change, but otherwise it's the exact same. And the same thing goes for Part 2. the logo's been changed, but otherwise this is the exact same front and back cover of the standalone. And here is part 3. This is identical to the standalone release. And of course, noting that this is the final director's cut with additional footage. So, yet another film that the video versions have a different edit. That's the rear cover. And then this is the Godfather family cover artwork. I don't know if this was released separately on Laserdisc or not. I can't remember if it was. It may have appeared on tape, and of course it's been also ported to the DVD and Blu-ray sets. So this is really just seeing it in its original, 420i form with a PCM audio track. Again, for then it was an interesting taste of what behind the scenes stuff was, but again, when you see it now, it doesn't really tell you anything you didn't know. Now, the discs themselves actually have nice, authentic, they tried to actually give it some class and prestige. So the sleeves are imprinted with the Godfather logo, and they're actually a glossy sleeve. Unfortunately, there's nothing inside them to protect the discs, so you really need to put some sort of extra sleeve or just the regular plastic cheapy one in there. Now, this set was very, very cheap, so I didn't mind it being beat up, but the seller didn't know at the time that the first disc was actually missing. So this set, it does not have the first disc, which has side 1 and 2 of The Godfather. So that's why I went ahead and also kept my standalone discs. So I have the standalone Godfather 1 and Godfather 2. So I kept those because I had checked this out to simply see if they were different, and they seem pretty much the same. It's the same transfers. It seems to be the same discs recycled, and the video pressing quality didn't seem really any different. So this is really just, if you come across it and you don't have the others, or you want the documentary disc on Laserdisc, you can pick this up. Again, it's not very common. This is sort of like their 25th anniversary Star Trek box set that boxed together the first 5 films as opposed to having them in the individual releases. So it's just really more of a box set, budget saver and shelf saver in terms of space. But the discs do have a nice custom gold Paramount logo, so that is a nice touch that kind of differentiates it. But again, this is really just, it's just a box set of the individual releases, and they added the documentary disc. Let me show you the rear before I forget. This, kind of similarly to others, just gives you a small picture of each film with its title and then the documentary in the bottom. Credit is being made in Japan. And I really wish this wasn't so banged up, because otherwise, it does look very classy. The gold is embossed, and the Paramount logo is embossed in gold. And this is actually apparently a numbered set. This is numbered number 1314. So I don't know how many this ran to, and I didn't realize for a long time this was numbered. That's probably why I haven't really seen any others of this particular box set. Like I said, the Godfather Saga set, even though it is rare, I've actually seen that once or twice in stores and such, but I've never seen another copy of this. Now here's a film that really uses the box set for practical reasons. This is the Laserdisc release of Kenneth Branagh's version of Hamlet, released by Warner Brothers. Has their widescreen logo down here. Has the grand image of the hall from the opening section of the film. Of course, this film was famously photographed in 70mm. It was practically the last film to be photographed entirely in 65mm stock with the real cameras 100% photochemically, and it really is a last gasp of that era of filmmaking, because nowadays people will, instead of 70mm, use IMAX cameras, which is really, even though it uses 65mm film, it's really a different format and style entirely, and is not the same as proper 70mm filmmaking and presentation as well. So you can actually still see 70 millimeter prints of this in the few houses that can actually still play 70 millimeter. And if you look on the N70 millimeter website listing of 70 millimeter presentations for the year that have been scheduled, if you look through the list, it's usually the same titles that keep appearing, and Branagh's Hamlet is usually among them, seeing as it was one of the absolute last ones done. Now, this is pretty much just a presentation of the film, because this film famously uses the entire text of the play and thus has a very extensive 4-hour runtime. Now, I will say, if you do give it a chance, even if you're not a big, Shakespeare nut, it moves with such a vibrancy a lot of the time that, it becomes easy in places to forget the mammoth runtime. Of course, on Laserdisc, this is spread across 5 sides. There's no real special features in here. The box set is merely to contain all of the discs inside. So again, I said this is a box set for practical reasons. Now, it does have a Dolby Surround encoded digital track, but unfortunately there is no AC3 and there was no DTS version. When it came in on DVD, they did add the 5.1, and it finally came out on Blu-ray in a digibook, which has a I think it has a slightly higher bitrate 5.1 track, but it's not a full-on lossless one, if I'm remembering correctly. And neither of those discs, they have good transfers. They're better because they're newer, more technically advanced and higher resolution ones, but they're not great. They're certainly not evidential of a 1996 100% 70 millimeter production, and in no way, shape, or form come close to capturing the grandiosity of the 70 millimeter film stock. Now, for Laserdisc, I was actually rather impressed by how good this looked, especially, if you have a good setup, a good system, and a good player, and everything's calibrated correctly, the image quality is actually very good on this. And I've had the DVD, and I put them side by side, and obviously the DVD is much better, spread across 2 discs for bitrate space, and is native 480p, whereas this is not. But I was actually very impressed. So this is a worthwhile and worthy way to watch the film. Don't be put off that it's an analog transfer without 5.1. In terms of the sound is very good. It's the same mix. It just is not discrete, so you won't get that full discrete channel separation. But of course, this being the full original text of the play, there's of course a lot of dialogue, so it doesn't really have a whole lot of sequences that are going to scream out for you to have discrete channel usage, because there's a lot of times where things kind of trail off into the soliloquies and monologues. So you're not losing a whole lot by not having the 5.1. Now, there are some instances, if I recall correctly, of this set having rot. I have not really run into any of that here, but it has been a while since I watched this particular release, but that is something to be aware of. I have seen this pop up relatively often, so it's a box set that you can get for pretty cheap, because I think that all that comes down to is this is the main Laserdisc release, and they seem to have printed a number of them, and I don't think many people wanted to have their hang on to a 4-hour Hamlet, especially since there's no special features. So again, just more of a necessity thing. There's not even a booklet, and the discs just have the standard Warner logo. Now, here's one I picked up. I had never seen the whole miniseries in its entirety, but I was quite surprised at how good this Laserdisc actually is. This is the release of the Lonesome Dove miniseries, and what's interesting about this Laserdisc is the film was, of course, designed and shot for television, originally presented in 1:3:3, like your TV screen would be, and has a mono soundtrack. Later releases on the remastered DVD and Blu-ray versions have reformatted to a 1:7:8 widescreen matted presentation with, I think there was a stereo version, and then I think it's also been redone in 5.1. And there's debate on the accuracy of this because it was shot as a feature film would have been shot, and you can tell they were, intending for television. And then there's debate on whether you can actually present it in widescreen and not wreck compositions. And I think this is indeed possible, but I think you'd have to sit there and actually mat each shot on a shot-by-shot basis to, preserve the compositions, because you can look up online, there's screen comparisons between the 133 original and the 178, and there's times where the widescreen just really kind of wrecks some of the compositions due to the placement of the letterboxing bars. So I do think the 133 format is the way this film should be seen. Well, I say film, it's a miniseries, of course. And it needs to be seen with its original mono mix, because the other gets, quite frankly, distracting. And even though the Blu-ray version is very cheaply available, the older DVD and Laserdisc, I think, is the way to go. It also has the original credit presentations for each section of the miniseries, the opening and closing credits, with the original typeface and fonts used. And I have to say, the picture quality on this release was actually quite surprising. I eventually found myself, just really getting into it, because, it really kind of gets off to a slow start, I would say. But, especially by the end, I really wouldn't want to be watching it on any other release. Of course, this came out via Image, and their early DVD release is essentially a porting of this. But of course, the audio switches from PCM mono to lossy Dolby Digital mono. So that is a downside. And I think, from what I've read, there were some issues with maybe a little bit of compression artifacting here and there, because it would have been an early DVD release. But the picture quality would probably be on par, and technically should be better than this Laserdisc, because it is a DVD versus Laserdisc. But they're pretty much roughly equal, but this, you get the benefit of having the PCM mono. And as far as I'm concerned, it's the best release of the miniseries in terms of audio quality. And because of the original framing, the original color timing, everything being as authentic as possible to the original television airing, for me, this is so far to date the best release around. Now, the rear cover is quite nice. The chapter indexes and the separate parts are broken down. The miniseries is spread over 7 sides, and side 8 has a small making of featurette. I don't think there's many extras on the later releases either, so that's roughly about all you get in terms of extras, even on the later releases. So you're not really missing out on much by just having this. Now, the box itself is one of the spine-joined flip boxes, but I think it works pretty well. It opens like this, and the discs just have the standard Image Entertainment logo. So again, this miniseries, it really can be an acquired taste. It is of its era, but it is roughly made just like a feature film. So if you imagine all of the episode breaks not being there, you could just look at it as a long feature film. So the Laserdisc is highly recommended. It's rather uncommon and can get kind of pricey, but you'd really want this for the original sound in PCM and the original framing and everything being authentic to the original television air dates. Next, we have Return to Lonesome Dove, the follow-up mini-series to the original. As far as I can tell, there was also another one that had a different title that was a quasi-follow-up, was also based on other material by the same author. So these two kind of compete with one another. Neither is really regarded as being as good as the original. But I found this, it was in the same bin as the original, so I figured I'd pick it up and watch it at some point, since I had always meant to see the original as well. So again, it's the same packaging type. It has a connected spine flip box. So you open it up. I remove the foam insert. It has the standard Image label, but it's been colored this sort of pink, which is interesting, I guess. And here's the rear cover. Of course, this was the audio track on here was produced in stereo, so it is stereo in PCM. I can't recall, I don't think this was matrix encoded. I think I tried it, just toggling it on, but it really didn't do anything, so it's just flat stereo. Again, it's much more miniseries in feeling than the original. It doesn't have the same amount of scope and broadness of the original, but you know, there are worse ways to waste a couple hours, or you know, I spread this out over a couple different nights. So again, pretty much laid out and designed exactly like the first series on Laserdisc, and again, not super common, but a little bit less pricey than the original. So when you get one, you kind of have to grab the other if it's there or available. Now here we have a very important release. This is the letterbox edition of It's a Mad, 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 Mad World from MGM, and credited as the new restored version. Now when this came out, in a lot of ways it's like the Roadshow Laserdisc of the Alamo. They had the standard version that was the cut down version that was circulated for years. It has its own Laserdisc release. It's had other video releases. But what this version did is they had newly unearthed some various reels that had additional scenes that hadn't been used since the longer versions in the original full-length premiere version. So they incorporated it into the short version to make this Laserdisc edition that for many, many years was the longest version of the film available. It would also pop up on Turner Classic Movies airings. So when I first saw the film on TCM, I saw this long version and couldn't understand why it was this weird edition that was much longer than all of the other available video versions. So that's why this is important. Let me show you the rear here. It's just a flip standard lift top box like other MGM releases. Lovingly using the original poster artwork, which is completely iconic and looks great on the Laserdisc jacket. Here you have a little description of the film with a few mentions of, you know, this having additional footage, and a thank you note to Stanley Kramer and others for, you know, collaborating in making this. Now the picture transfer is letterboxed. It does have a Dolby Surround encoded Matrix PCM track. Of course, this film was originally presented in Ultra Panavision 70, which was the ultra-wide 2.76:1 ratio of 70 millimeter, and would have had a 6-track magnetic audio mix, and famously even had the audio that would run in the bathrooms and lobby during the intermission break with police band chatter from the events ongoing in the film, which was still apparently going on while you were in the intermission. Of course, that is not on here, and this is not 100% complete because it was just random bits and pieces that they found and reincorporated. So this version runs a little over 3 hours. And the picture quality for the time is actually quite good, even though a lot of the additional material does have, you know, all kinds of degraded elements and such. And the audio is excellent also, because you have to keep that in mind, that the various elements have come from all kinds of different places. Now, this has finally been supplanted by the Criterion release, which went out of its way to try and create the original Roadshow version from its premiere right down to having the intermission chatter. And they had to do a worldwide search and find all the additional missing elements, which were in all kinds of various states. So that was presented in a as best as we can do it in the modern era stage. So there are shots in there that are faded. There are shots in there with remnants of Japanese subtitles that they couldn't scrub out completely. So that is really, like this, another as-is presentation of the long version. But what makes it different from this, and why this is still important, is they found that there was, I believe it's, I can't remember if it's 1 or 2 shots that were put in this version that were not actually in the premiere engagement version. So those were left out of the Criterion long version and were not included as extras or anything. So the only way you can see those 1 or 2 little snippets are on this Laserdisc release, which is why this is still important to hang on to. So other than that, this has been supplanted completely by the Criterion version, but for the longest time, this was how you had to watch the film. Now, it's pretty much like the other MGM sets. You get this little paper insert, photographs from the film, and then the chapter breakdown. So, and then you get this little paragraph about, they call it the restoration of, but it was just really the creation of a longer version by incorporating that newly discovered footage. So anyway, that's the long Mad World box set on Laserdisc, and why even in this day and age it can still be viewed as being important. So it's useful to have in conjunction with the Criterion version. So this is another one of the legendary among Laserdisc circles big box sets that really tries to do what the format's packaging was capable of, some degree of justice. This is the 30th anniversary My Fair Lady box set, the premiere of the Robert Harris Jim Katz restoration on home video, and the release where they really tried to get as much of their restoration across onto home video and consumer televisions of the day. This is really an incredible piece of work and a really fantastic box set that really went for broke in trying to give the film a degree of respect on video. And as you can see, I have left on the price tag for how much I got this for. I was amazed that I bought this for $3.99. At that price, I could not turn it down. And you can actually get this box set in this day and age. It's not going to cost you a whole lot, and for being such an important and well-known Laserdisc box set, I definitely would say it's worth it. Of course, it's now been completely outclassed by the digital restoration that Robert Harris was able to go back and do, that went far beyond what they were able to do in the photochemical realm. Of course, had it not been for their work in the early 90s, the digital restoration as it stands would not have been possible, due to them actually performing many duties that saved the film, not only in presentation, but actually preservation of the elements themselves. And so with the new digital tools, they were able to go much further than they were able to ever have done in the photochemical realm. So the new Blu-ray is absolutely essential ownership, and I'm not even a fan of musicals at all. It's my least favorite genre, and I grew up hating musicals. I can appreciate them technically, but that Blu-ray is one of the best of the entire format, so it's a must-own. And just as this Laserdisc was for its time period. Now, this replaced earlier pan and scan versions. The transfer is, of course, letterbox with a 2.0 Dolby Surround encoded matrix track. There was later a standalone release that added 5.1 AC3, which I wish they had gotten in this box set. It's really the one thing that's missing. But this was 93, 94 before that really took off on Laserdisc in 94, 95. Now, the box set is interesting because all the sides are actually with this black and white striped alternating design that goes with Eliza's famous racetrack dress as pictured on the cover. So, just trying to show that off because that's the first thing that jumped out to me, because of course when you see just the picture online, you don't see the sides. The back has one of the lovely paper inserts glued on that describes the features. Of course, you have the film, you have the making of documentary that's been ported to other releases. And then you have the little blurb about the THX processed Laserdisc. It includes the soundtrack CD, which is a gold CD, and then it includes a book about the book about the film with some pictures and things. And then it includes another book, which I can't remember what that is. That is the it's the Making of Then and Now book that's about the film. It's really just a portfolio of some of Cecil Beaton's designs, and then the Beaton's diary, which was republished, simply called Fair Lady. But the most interesting part, especially for me being such a super huge geek, is you actually get a film clip of a 70mm print. And I don't know, I suppose this is from the restoration, so they apparently took various segments of the film, because these box sets include different frames from different sequences, so they seem to have literally cut one up and included it. And as heartbreaking as that is, one would hope it was just one that couldn't be used for some reason, or leftovers or things. You actually get a clip of a 70mm print of My Fair Lady included in here. One wishes one could have an entire 70mm print, but we're not millionaires who can do that in our house. Anyway, it is another one of these hinge boxes. Now, like Dances with Wolves, this one actually opens up and you can leave it standing up, so that is at least a nice help. They keep with the black and white checkered design mosaic on here. Now here you get the offer for a mail away for the anniversary theatrical reissue poster. I wish that was still valid. It's kind of interesting how that actually opens up, and you can actually mail this section off. Always nice when you find the original mail-in parts still included. Now here is the booklet for the Laserdisc with the cover image supplanted in the checkered pattern. Details about the film. Here's the cast and credit list on some beautiful sketch artwork for the film. Again, everything about this is it just screams classiness. Again, this is just really more text and stills from the film. Kind of more historical background and kind of bits and pieces about the costuming, the set design, the songs, the lyric writing, and then a little bit of breakdown of information about various key cast and crew members. And here you have your chapter index. The film really goes across, it goes across 4 sides, and then the rest of side 4 and side 5 and side 6 are devoted to the supplemental features, the bulk of which are taken up by the documentary piece. And of course, all of this information about the restoration is about the photochemical restoration in '93 or so. So all of that no longer applies to the newer digital restoration. So you have to keep that in mind. They are 2 separate things. Now, each disc is lovingly packaged in a custom sleeve with the cover artwork. And it is thankfully got a polyline sleeve inside, which is a great help. And the discs have a custom Fox label with a pink label and the actual film logo text, which is a nice touch. Anytime you're going to do one of these big box sets, I don't understand why they wouldn't make a custom label like others would. Of course, the rights ownership of My Fair Lady started with, it's a Warner Brothers production, but CBS had the rights to the stage production and the soundtrack, so eventually it reverted from Warner Brothers to CBS, and they've distributed it through Paramount at times. They've done other ones, and the Laserdisc was of course done through Fox, which is why their logo's on here. The rear of each jacket has the black and white alternating design. Again, extremely classy. I love that. They could have just had that and I would have been happy. I just don't know why it looks amazing on this. It's hard to lift these out and not bend them. Now you get to the extras down here. They're nicely packaged in a velvet tray. It's a bit loose, but everything's lined up to where it's not going to slide around and get damaged. Here is the soundtrack release. Now you could get this separately, and it is on a gold CD, but this one has a slightly different cover that mimics the Laserdisc cover. It just mentioned it's on a 24 karat gold CD. Now, it was really more of a marketing thing back in the 90s. A lot of Mobile Fidelity Sound Lab CD releases were also done on gold discs, as were some Audio Fidelity ones. The idea was that, it was supposed to be more durable and was supposed to be a better conductor for the laser to read the pits of the disc, but that's really more academic, and it was really more of a marketing ploy. It really is not going to change anything once you read the digital data, especially if you rip it from the disc to your hard drive. So this is a rendering of the original soundtrack. I think there have been several other releases since then, so this is just what you would have been able to get in the 90s. I don't know if there's a definitive score soundtrack release on CD as of now, but I think there have been several after this. But still, it's a nice to have, and it's nice that they actually included the gold CD in here. Here is the printing of Beaton's journal, titled Fair Lady. It's actually printed as a hardcover with dust jacket, so I believe this would have been sold separately, but they just included it here. And it's a full-on book. I believe there's some, yeah, here are some photo sections, which are lovingly printed. This doesn't mean it's wonderful this is actually included, but this is definitely more of, for your diehard My Fair Lady fans. But anyway, usually you would have just gotten an excerpt of the book, so it's interesting to see and pretty awesome that they included the whole thing. Now, this is the portfolio of original costume designs by Beaton as well. Credited as being limited imprint. I suppose that just means they just made this for the box set. Here you have the note about its inclusion here. And here they are just presented. You slip this out so I can show you. And these are incredibly well printed on very high quality sturdy paper, so they're very, very well done. Kind of flip through these. And again, even if you're not a fan of the particular film, it's just, being a part of, it's a part of history, really. It's like finding any historical document. So it's just really something that gives it a whole other touch of class and another physical connection to a film from a now bygone era. Just some incredible design work, I think. Sign of the amount of time and attention to care and detail that went into this production. And last but certainly not least, of course I would have been just happy if there had been no box and this had been included because I'm a geek. This is the 70mm print selection. So you actually have it in an actual holder, which is a very, very nice touch, instead of just being tucked in a little plastic bag or something. And then you also have it here so you can actually view it correctly. And as you can see, I don't know how well this is going to turn up in the light. I'm trying to get it to an angle where you can actually see. This is from this particular section is from, let me make sure, yeah, it's from a scene later on in the film towards the climax. But as is obvious, this seems to be from the restoration print. It doesn't have any of the color fading that would have been on an original 70mm print, because those were original 70mm prints of most any film from the 60s and 70s is extremely prone to color fading. So if you manage to see one, or clips from one, or snippets from one like this, it's almost always going to be red shifted or shifted to pink because the colors have faded. But you can see the aspect ratio is the 2.21 to 1 of 70mm, which is why it's so wide. The 70mm frame is roughly double the size of 35mm, hence its size. And you have the multiple perforations per frame more than the normal 4 perforation standard of 35mm frames. But it's just a really, really interesting thing to have. I'm going to slip this out in case it's a little more visible that way. But it is literally a snippet of the 70mm print itself. And it has the date coding on the side. And presumably this would have... yeah, the 70mm prints would have been run on the anniversary in '93 or so, and I believe they would have still used magnetic audio at that time. In the 90s, magnetic audio had would pretty much die out entirely, and all 70mm showings would switch to using a variant of the DTS disc system, and they just called that DTS 70 for short. So if you manage to see a 70mm film these days, it's almost always going to be a DTS 5.1 presentation synced to the 70mm print. So anyway, But this is just one of the very famous Laserdisc sets that a lot of people know and love and treasure. It's definitely a display piece. It's a coffee table piece, absolutely, and it's readily available. It's rather common. You don't have to pay a whole lot for it. You just want to make sure you get it with all of the pieces included and complete, and not dinged up or anything. But it's a nice piece to have. It's a film that's very famous for its intricate production, and I'm actually glad that I bought it. Of course, it was so cheap. I had to. I felt, but I'd always intended to pick it up and just see what it looked like, because I think it's really interesting to see what old film photochemical restorations look like. Sometimes there can be extreme differences when comparing photochemical restorations to the later digital ones, where they're able to achieve a lot more. Sometimes there's complete differences in color and density and brightness. Sometimes the soundtrack is remixed. Sometimes the sound is entirely different. It just depends. So I think it's really interesting to have this stuff as sort of a snapshot of how the film was presented at a time and what the original restorations look like. So that is the 30th anniversary of My Fair Lady box, one of the famous, very important prestige Laserdisc box sets, and definitely worthy of being in any Laserdisc collection.